Hi everybody, it's Armand. Today we're going to go over fuel system stuff. Now this is a very broad topic and there are a lot of facets to it, so I'm going to attempt to go over as much as I think I can cram into this video, and hopefully I don't skip over too much stuff. Meanwhile, I'll go and throw a table of contents up for this video, so if you already know a bunch of this stuff, you can just select where you want to go with the timestamps. Oh, you want to watch the video? Okay, so we're going to start off with just the basics of fuel systems. Now in this video, I'm primarily going to be going over port injection stuff since that's relevant to most of my followers and customers. Some of this stuff can be applied to carbureted systems, just about all of it, except for the injector part, and then direct injection, and once again that will not be injector related because we're not really going over those. Primarily we'll be discussing stuff that relates to gasoline, ethanol, and a lot of that can carry over to methanol as well. As far as going over to diesel, that's not my realm, but some of the concepts will still carry over. Now, as far as basic fuel systems go, the way a fuel system works is very simple. You have a tank where you fill up all of the fuel. You have a pump that moves the fuel to the engine. You have, somewhere in the system, you have a regulator that regulates how much pressure is in the system. And then when you get to the engine side of things, you usually have injectors. Now, like I said, carbureted systems, you don't have injectors, but you have some injectors, and their job is to disperse the fuel on command from the ECU. So they need to be, they need to be receiving a certain amount of pressure. That's all stuff we'll go over later in the video. But the injectors are usually mounted into what is called a fuel rail. And all a fuel rail is a rail that you mount your injectors to. This one is for 4 cylinders. The fuel goes into the rail, and it sits here sort of as like a mini reservoir, waiting to be dispensed from any of the injectors as they are commanded to do so. And then outside of this, there are some systems that include a fuel filter. Fuel filter can be any number of things. It can be one that is in the tank just before it is pulled out of the tank, and there can also be ones that are in line as the fuel is in transit to the front of the car. There can be some sort of filter that, cleans up the fuel or has a certain amount of particulate removed from it. So the main components here, those are the main components, but the main things that we get from this are going to be fuel pressures, the fuel flow rate, and the injector rates. So when you have a system, you need to know what pressure it operates at. Factory systems will operate usually between 40 and 60 psi, and that is because below 40 psi you will get poor atomization from an injector, and above 60 psi you won't get any better of atomization, but you do overwork your pump. And as you'll see as we go over pump mathematics, you'll see how that can negatively affect things. No need to overwork the system. The next important one is the fuel flow rate, which is how much fuel is actually being transported. This is usually in liters per hour or gallons per minute. And then the last component is the injector rate. So how fast are the injectors able to inject fuel? This is usually rated in something like pounds per minute or in milliliters or cc's per minute, something like that. And that's just, that's usually measured at a certain PSI and at a certain at being full wide open for 1 entire minute. And we'll go over how to calculate those as well. Those are all the basics for now though. So let's step into the general configurations of fuel systems. So this is going to be a jump. So let's go over a basic system. I will use the NC Miata, which you guys know me for usually. So the NC Miata, it's a pretty simple system. It is what you call a deadhead system. What this means is the fuel pump is in the tank, it takes the fuel, and it regulates it in the tank, the pressure. It generates the pressure, any excess pressure is dissipated off in the tank, and it sends out approximately 55 psi from the tank to the front of the car. Once it reaches the front of the car, there are some losses, so you may not see all 55 psi. It enters the rail, and then it sits there. It doesn't move around unless fuel is dispensed from one of the injectors. So as the fuel's sitting there, it's not moving around, it's just waiting to be injected. So key on, the fuel goes up to pressure, and then nothing moves. That is called deadhead because there is no movement and the fuel is sent and then it just stops at the rail. There's no returning of fuel. And this is a very simple system. It's very cheap, but the problem is it runs reactive based. So if all of your injectors were to be high demand suddenly, you would have a pressure drop in the rail, and then the pump, which is now 10 feet away, would have to react and say, oops, gotta send fuel, and then it sends it. So that is reactive based. There is a delay between the components. The next thing is there's a very poor regulation of pressure. So you end up sending this fuel at 55 psi. How do you know what it is at the other end? When there is a large draw at the front of the engine, at the front of the car, in the engine, then the fuel pressure up front ends up being very irregular. So with all the regulation being in the back, how do you know how much fuel pressure you have at the front? At a low RPM, low demand, it's pretty easy to keep 50 something psi in the front, but at high demand, particularly when you have a turbo or a supercharger, you end up having an unevenness of pressure, which can cause uneven fueling to the injectors. So you can end up having one running very rich and one running very lean. And if you're running, let's say, like on the Miata, you're running 4-cylinder, the first 2 cylinders may run rich. The 3rd cylinder may run a little leaner, and the last cylinder could run very, very lean. But how do you know? Because they're all coming out of one exhaust, and those are going to be read by one O2 sensor. And that one O2 sensor, or wideband sensor, could read perfectly fine because the average of them comes out okay. And that can be misleading. But it is the cheap system, it works for the stock car. So the other type of system that a lot of people refer to is the return system. The idea of the return system, you can install them in many different configurations, as we'll discuss. But the whole idea of a return system is the fuel is sent all the way to the front of the car, and then it is regulated near the fuel rail, either before or after, and then whatever is not used gets sent back to the tank. So this requires 2 lines at the very minimum, 2 main lines, one to send and one to return, and this can allow you to have all of the fuel running through the rail at all the times. So if you have, let's say, a 300 liter per hour pump, you are getting all 300 liters per hour pumping through the rail, whether you're using it or not, because the remainder comes back to the tank. And this allows a lot of fun stuff. This allows you to have, you can use a regulator in these type of systems that can be right next to the rail. So it'll be very real regulation. It is very close by. There will be very little delay. You can also use it after the rail, so it'll be even better regulated. So that would mean the fuel flows through the rail, and then it hits the regulator. And then you can have a manifold compensation, which is this little vacuum thing. This is the example regulator we'll be using today. It has a little nipple on here that you connect into your manifold. So boost pressure will feed back into here, or vacuum, and it'll be able to increase the pressure of regulation to make sure that you are staying above that level of pressure you need in your injectors. Again, we'll get into that in a little bit. And then the constant circulation of the fuel helps with temperature, because then you don't have fuel just sitting in there boiling, warming up. You have fuel constantly going from your tank. Now the downside of this is it is a more complex system, and it is a little more expensive because you have more parts. But there are ways to set these types up to where they aren't so expensive, and there are ways to set them up where they're very expensive, but they're also very, very good. Now, the deadhead system, in honesty, it actually is a return system. However, it's where the return is located that makes it called a deadhead system, because it still has to be regulated. So I'll throw a diagram up. This is your basic fuel system, just like I described. You have a fuel tank with a pump located inside of it, and a fuel pressure regulator as well. So before it ever leaves the tank, it's regulated, and then it sends out to the fuel rail. The next configuration is when you put the fuel pressure regulator right outside of the tank. So the pump's in the tank, the fuel pressure regulator is right outside of the tank. It does exactly the same thing, because it ultimately sends the long distance of fuel to the rail. So you still have that problem of the delay. But that is still a return system, because now you see line A leads to the fuel pressure regulator, and then line C returns from the regulator. But the type of system that we idealize is the third one, which is there's a pump, the pump sends the fuel through the rail, and after the rail, preferably a short distance on line B, it hits the regulator and then it goes back on line C. This type of system is really great for that whole evenness of distribution. You don't have that immense pressure drop across each of the injectors. You end up having a really nice even flow across all of the injectors. All right, moving right along, we're going to jump into calculations. So you need to know, how much fuel do you need? This is usually the big question I get. How much fuel do I need? What size pump? What size injector? What's right for me? Because obviously you don't want to underfuel, and you don't want to spend an exorbitant amount of money and end up just having a super overkill fuel system, although that is pretty cool. So we need to know how much estimated horsepower you're going to run. If you don't have a clue how much you're going to run, maybe consult a friend, someone else who's done the same build, or your engine builder, or even your turbo, because you should probably go by your turbo if you're running a turbo or supercharger. So how much horsepower? The type of fuel, as we will actually use in the next step, which is the brake-specific fuel consumption. So if you're using a gasoline, you can choose your brake-specific fuel consumption, the BSFC factor, on the high number. This sheet I'm putting up here, this is from the Raceworks website. They have a range of what numbers to use for the BSFC number. Now, most people don't know what the BSFC number is of their engine, so just use the higher number. That'll give you your conservative answer. So the equations we're going to use in order to figure out our numbers here are going to be one for pump and one for injectors. So the one for pump, it is the horsepower estimate multiplied by the brake-specific fuel consumption number, and that will give you pounds per hour of fuel that you need. And then the other equation is the horsepower multiplied by the brake-specific fuel consumption divided by the max duty cycle you want to run your injectors, which is either recommended by the injector data sheet, or you can use 80% as a general rule of thumb, and then you divide by your number of injectors. That will give you the pounds per hour that you need your injectors to be rated for. So let's do a sample calculation. I'm going to go ahead and go through with an example I've prepared of a 400 horsepower naturally aspirated V8 running on gasoline. So we're going to assume it has a 0.5 brake-specific fuel consumption and an 80% duty cycle on the injectors. So the fuel pump itself, per our calculation, is 400 horsepower multiplied by 0.5, and that gives us 200 liters per hour. Cool. So we need to find ourselves a pump for this build that is 200 liters per hour at a minimum. Well, if the next one up is a 240 or a 300, that seems like a good choice. We can stay with that one. That works. Usually you just go the next step up, never want to go a step down, because if the 200 is the requirement, then being a little bit over will be a good safety factor. Next, we're going to discuss the injector. So the calculation for the injector is 400 horsepower multiplied by the 0.5 divided by 80% and divided by 8 injectors. And that gives us about 32 pounds per hour, which is about 336 cc's. So if you look up some injectors, they'll be rated in cc's, and others they'll be rated in pounds per hour. Once again, if we're looking for injectors and we can't find a 32 pounds per hour injector, then we'll say, what's the next increment? Let's say it's a 38 or a 40 or a 42. Sure, that's fine. It's not crazy over what the number we're looking at as, but that falls within our category. Once again, we don't want to be on the low side. So I have a secondary example. We're going to do a turbo 800 horsepower V6 running on E85. So that gives us, according to our sheet, a 0.91 brake-specific fuel consumption on the conservative side. And once again, we're going to stay with an 80% duty cycle. So the pump calculation is going to come out as 800 horsepower multiplied by 0.91, and that gives us 728 liters per hour. So if you can find one pump that puts out 728 liters per hour, awesome. They do make some. They're very fancy. They're very powerful. Later on, we'll discuss what happens when you can't find one pump to do your job. Next, we need injectors. So we have 800 horsepower, and we multiply the 800 times the 0.91 again, we divide by 80% duty cycle, and we divide by our 6 cylinders. That comes out to a whopping 152 pounds per hour, which is about a 1596 cc injector. That is fairly high volume for an injector. But there you go. There is your sample calculation. Moving right along, if you are building your fuel system, you have your car built, let's say, and you want to be planning out the fuel system to go with this build. So you need to ask yourselves a couple of questions. Are you running boost? Because if you're running boost, it is highly advisable to run a return system with a vacuum reference regulator, much like the one I mentioned before. This guy. The vacuum reference will make sure that you maintain enough fuel pressure at all times. Now, why is that? So when you run fuel pressure, you have, let's say, 50 psi being sent to the regulator, or you have your fuel being sent to the regulator, and the regulator is set to 50 psi. When you have boost, boost means you have pressure in the intake manifold above atmospheric. So if you run above atmospheric pressure, what happens is the pressure in the manifold pushes against the injectors. So the injectors end up, they may be running 50 psi on the back of the injector, but when you have, let's say, 10 psi of boost, the 10 psi of boost now pushes backwards on the injector. So your net pressure that the injector is working with is now 40 psi. Well, now let's say you're running a 50 psi fuel system and you're running 20 psi of boost. Now when you are at full boost, you end up having 30 psi equivalent of fuel injector pressure, and that's not okay. So the beauty of these little regulators is that you run the little vacuum tube over to it, and as the boost goes up, it pushes in the back of the regulator, and the regulator pushes your fuel pressure up 1 to 1. You go up 1 psi in boost, it goes up 1 psi fuel pressure. So you end up running a 50 psi fuel system, and when it goes into boost, if you run 10 psi, then you end up at 60 psi fuel pressure. So it helps maintain very solid injection. And we want to have really good injection for our turbo systems or supercharged systems. Next thing is you need to know what type of fuel are you running. So once again, like we had mentioned before, if you're running gasoline, it's one thing. If you're running ethanol, it is another thing because you will need more fuel, so you need to calculate for that, as well as methanol. And also that comes into what we're going to discuss next piece, which is the flex fuel. Do you need to have a flex fuel sensor? So if you plan on running pure ethanol 85%, great, cool, no compensation needed. But many people find that the fuel at the pump is more affordable. It is, but it's very irregular. So in order not to blow your motor up, due to the varying content, 55, 60, 70% ethanol, you don't want to run one tune for all of that. You want to run what is called a flex fuel sensor. It's a little sensor that detects the content of ethanol on the fly, and it can compensate the engine based off of that. It's an important detail if you plan on running an unchecked fuel. Next component is, are you going to be pushing the limits of your stock fuel system? So physically, you have to understand on your fuel system, are the lines on your stock fuel system big enough to handle the amount of power you want to put through them? We'll discuss line sizing in the next slide, but that is a very important thing. You can't run a really, really tiny line and expect to put 2,000 horsepower through it. With a big enough pump, maybe you can, but it's pushing a boulder up a hill for no reason. And then that also goes to say that you probably should make sure that your lines are ethanol friendly in your car as well. If they are not, or if they are friendly toward the fuel that you're using. So not all systems are all fuels friendly. Next thing is pump size, of course. If your stock pump can handle what you're doing, don't even worry about it, but I'm completing a build right now where the stock pump is not going to be adequate. So I am upgrading the pump to make sure that the new motor going in has enough fuel when the guy decides to wind it out. And then the last thing is, does the stock system support in the system that you're trying to run? Like if you were trying to run a return system and you have a car that has a deadhead system, then obviously the stock configuration doesn't work, so you need to reconfigure your stock system. This goes to the next question, which is, do you want to keep your stock fuel tank? If you're not even here and you say, you know what, I'm already running a fuel cell or something, cool, go you. Those are awesome. If you're having to run the stock fuel tank, there may be some solutions for you. Like the BRZ FRS community has a drop-in fuel assembly on theirs that completely transforms the system into a return and surge system. I haven't discussed what a surge system is yet, but we'll discuss it in one of the next topics. But that's something to consider. Certain systems have aftermarket development to allow them to have fancy upgrades like that. Next thing is, are you expecting high G-force loading that could possibly lead to tank starvation or pump starvation? So if you're doing something that involves extreme G's, whether it is high acceleration, high braking, or hard turning, that could really screw up if your pump is trying to pick up fuel and there is no fuel there. That could lead to a litany of problems. You could have pump damage, you could have engine damage, any sort of thing like that. So that's something to consider when you are designing your system. We'll discuss a little more of how to get around that in a bit. Next thing is, do you have so much power that one set of injectors is not going to cut it? So a fun topic that you'll see on some of the really big power cars is they'll have multiple sets of injectors. Or hey, if you even go look at the we had a 91 RX-7 in here recently, and it had two sets of injectors for some reason. So only one set would work at idle, and then when it got to a certain RPM, the second set would kick in. So then it would have the equivalent of two sets of injectors feeding fuel into it. So if the one injector runs out of fuel at, let's say, 5,000 RPM, and you still have another 3,000 or 4,000 RPM to go, you have a second injector that can hop in on that. The same can be said for fuel pumps. If you have a fuel pump that delivers enough fuel up until a certain amount and you need more fuel, you add another fuel pump. We'll discuss how to do that in a bit. And then this is a really important one to go with what I just mentioned. Are your injectors too big to run stable at the idle you want? So you could buy the biggest injectors on the planet, but why won't you? Aside from cost prohibitiveness. Because some of these injectors, you can only open them as there's a minimum amount that they can be opened for. Your ECU will only go down to a certain amount that it can open it for. And if they are giant injectors, that tiny little spritz still might be too much fuel for your engine to try and idle at. So some systems you may find you can't idle below 1,000 RPM. You may be idling at 1,500, or you may be idling at 2,000 RPM if you just put the wrong set of injectors that are too big in it. Or it could just cause very unstable idle otherwise, and you end up with a car that dies on occasion. So I'm going to do a brief run over a couple of more advanced fuel topics. So I may have mentioned that you can have multiple pumps, so let's discuss that, or multiple rails. So on some configurations, it's ideal to have a singular pump. As discussed, most of your cars will just have a singular pump. It's in the tank, it sends fuel out. In some instances, you'll have a pump that's outside of the tank. So that'll mean you need to have some form of gravity feed to get the fuel out of the tank into the pump. This isn't super ideal in some situations, but some situations people do this. Like on old cars that used to be carbureted, they'll usually have a gravity-fed system. So people will run a pump outside of there to make it easier to send fuel to the front. And then in some instances, people will have two pumps where they'll have the pump inside of the tank that is strictly being used to get fuel out of the tank. It's not used to actually generate pressure in the system. It is strictly being used as what is called a lift pump. This is a common thing that diesel people will know. And that's because, or people with direct injection systems as well. The pump in the back is strictly to get the fuel out of the tank and to the front of the car, or to wherever the main pump is. And the main pump can be referred to as the pressure pump or whatever. But that's the pump that actually generates the pressure. So its job is actually lessened because it doesn't have to get the fuel out of the tank. And the fuel that's coming out of the tank, that pump uses very little effort because it's not having to generate pressure as well as move the fuel. So this system would be lift pump, main pump. And you can get two separate pumps. A good instance of this would be such as our NC Miata here. So there's only so big of a pump that I can get into the stock container. So if I run it with pressure, its output is lower than if I run it free without pressure. We'll discuss that when we get to the section of selection of pumps, but pumps will always run way more fuel when you have no pressure that's resisting them. So this would allow you to run a different pump, let's say a higher duty pump, a heavier duty pump that can achieve higher pressures, and have that separate. And then there's the instance of having multiple pumps in a different configuration. So instead of one doing the lifting and the other doing the pressuring, you could have both of them doing both of the work. This is what I had mentioned earlier with the staged pumps. So the staging would mean that if you have one pump that's good for 300 horsepower and a second pump identical to it, that's also good for 300 horsepower, but your car makes, let's say, 500 horsepower. You don't need to have both pumps running at all times, but you can have the one pump run up until a certain amount, and then kick on the other pump, and then both of them help. This can happen because you could be running a regulator, let's say, that is rated for 1,000 horsepower, allegedly 1,000 horsepower, but it can't handle 2 pumps worth at idle. So the 2 pumps sending all of their flow is over the level that the regulator can handle. But if the engine's consuming 1 full fuel pump worth of fuel, then the regulator will have no trouble. These would usually be like, as I said, staged. So that means you would have some sort of switch that says when you get to a certain RPM, engage the other pump. This actually falls over with injectors as well. So you can have on the injection system, you can have 2 rails that are, and I don't mean like in a V configuration where you have 1 and 1, I mean you have 2 rails to where you have 1 set of injectors and a second set of injectors that back them up. So you max out the first injectors, and then the second set of injectors turns on at a certain RPM in order to assist with the remaining amount that the first set of injectors can't produce. This is used, like I said before, in the much bigger drag car type builds where you have tons of horsepower, and it's not practical to have both sets running at all times, but it's also not practical to put 1 set of gigantic ones. Or hey, maybe you have the biggest injectors on the planet and you still need more fuel. Good problem to have. So you run 2 sets and maybe even 3 sets of rails. That's all some aftermarket ECU stuff. We haven't had to do that here at my shop, so I'm not going to talk too much about it. Same thing with the staged pumps. Haven't had to do any of that yet, but it's coming. And then the last more advanced system we're going to talk about is surge systems. Before we jump into surge systems, a quick note. So when you're sizing your lines, I had mentioned we had discussed quickly I touched about sizing of lines. Summit Racing has some general guidelines on sizing of components. So if you have a fuel system, how big do you need to have your fuel components? So we're going to go over the calculation of the fuel pump and the injectors and the regulator, but how big do your lines need to be? Personally, I usually just look at the components. Like this component here, this has 6 AN entries and a 6 AN return. So that means this thing's probably good for whatever the rating is. The rating is probably telling you that a 6 AN is adequate for what is going on with this system. When you move to larger components, they may all be 8 AN or 10 AN, and that's an indicator that, hey, this thing's going to need some flow. So like if you buy a fuel pump and it has a very small outlet, you'll be like, oh, this thing's probably not producing a lot of fuel. But some of the fuel pumps you buy, it'll have a 10 AN outlet, and you'll go, this thing is going to need some 10 AN line for the whole system. But just as some general guidelines, this is what Summit Racing says as far as horsepower ratings and sizing of lines. All right, so I mentioned surge systems. So surge systems are a very fun topic for me. I really like talking about these. So as we discussed before, you typically have your fuel pump. You can either have it in tank, out of tank, you can have a lift pump, cool, and you can have a pressure pump. Well, on the lift pump, pressure pump configuration, that's kind of what ends up happening with the surge system. But with the pressure pump, it's actually located inside of a small fuel tank. And the lift pump, as we were saying, it is actually on its own free circuit with 0 pressure, or low pressure at very least. So you have your main tank, it sends out of its own pump, the lift pump, and that sends it into the surge tank. The surge tank is a much smaller fuel tank, and its job is to stay full at all times. This means when you have a very high demand and a high G-force, if the lift pump starves out because that fuel pump is in a half full tank, you won't actually have a problem because now the surge tank can take over and it is still full, and so it can start draining away from that. The fuel pump is completely submerged inside of that. Now whatever fuel is being fed into the surge tank, once the surge tank's full, it sort of has a free flow back to the main tank. So you have line A going out, line B coming back, and it can just sit there and circulate freely. There's no pressure because it relieves it back into the tank. There's no regulator. The regulation is itself, is the thing full. Now the pump that's inside the surge tank is used as the main pump. It is the pump that sends to your fuel rail, and the fuel pressure regulator returns it back to the surge tank. So really you have 2 outs and 2 ins from your surge tank. Free flow entry and 2 free flow returns, one from the regulator and one that is going back to the main tank. So in theory, you should never have a problem with having too much return. There won't be a backup on this system. It's a really nice system, but it does get complex because then you have a fuel tank and you have a surge tank, and you have to locate the surge tank. And usually surge tanks are noisy because they'll run a high performance pump inside of them. That being said, if you would prefer, you could still run an inline fuel pump with a surge tank. It's just usually that when you buy a surge system, they come with pumps inside of them. And they also can come with staged system of pumps, so you can have multiples. In my situation, what I'll be doing with this car behind me is the main fuel pump, that the biggest fuel pump that I can fit into this car in the stock tank cannot provide enough fuel for the build I am doing. So what I am angling to do is I'm going to use the ability of the surge tank that we're using. It has 1 pump in it. I'm going to put another pump in it as well and use it as a staged system, so the surge tank will actually also serve as my staged injection, my staged fueling. So up until a certain amount, the first fuel pump can handle the business. But after that amount, if the first fuel pump runs out, I'm going to be in trouble. So I have the second pump there that can kick on, and it can be commanded on via some stuff we'll be able to do, and it'll just be able to kick on at a certain RPM, and then we have enough fuel. But the fuel pressure regulator at the front of the system is going to be just barely able to handle the amount of fuel that both can produce. So again, we don't need to have them both running at all times. That's just impractical. Cool, so now that we've gotten through all of those topics, what fuel pump do I need? All right, I happen to have some DeechWorks ones here on my desk. So here are all the points. What type of installation are you doing? Are you looking for a drop-in installation? So you need to look up your car and figure out what pump fits into your car. So what I have here sitting on my desk is a DeechWorks box, and inside of it is a DeechWorks 300C. It is the compact 340 liter per hour model, right? So this guy fits directly into the NC Miata, as well as a bunch of other versions of vehicles, but it fits into our NC Miatas. So that's what we put in them. Do we need all 340 liters per hour? No, but let's discuss with that whole calculation, or with the data sheet. So when you do your calculation, you figure out how much fuel you need to know if your pump will be able to do it. So when you pull out your data sheet, I'll just put one on the screen. So you pull out your data sheet, it tells you all the details about it. So let's say that you're trying to get 200 liters per hour at 40 psi. Well, great news. This fuel pump's going to be able to do it, because if you look, the liters per hour at 40 psi of this is 340. But if you're trying to say that you need 275 liters per hour and you're going to be running 20 psi a boost on top of a 50 psi base psi fuel pressure system, then you're going to be right on the money, and that's probably not the greatest solution. So 70 psi of fuel pump on this model gives you 275 liters per hour. So it's kind of a closer call. But those details come with every fuel pump, and they're usually public information, so you can just look them up and see what you're getting into before you get there. The maximum pressure of your fuel pump's kind of a big deal. So this one says on the data sheet that it's rated for 100 psi. That's it. So it hits the pressure relief valve at 100 psi. Oh, that's another thing. Do you need to have an internal check valve? Some of the pumps won't have an internal check valve, but this style does. Let's see. I have all of these details of things you need to look into if you're trying to buy one, if they matter. The inlet and outlet sizing. If you're doing an OE configuration, then the inlet and outlet sizing is not really a thing, because the objective is for it to pop into an OE position. But if you're using an external one, then you need to figure out, do you need to have a 6AN, 8AN, 10AN, etc. What kind of fuel fitting sizes are you needing? Then, as you'll see also on that graph, what kind of amperage demand there is. Not all fuel pumps are going to be up to, they're not going to be as low of standard as the system that comes in the car. If you are improving or increasing the amount of flow that your stock configuration is running, you may actually run into an over amperage situation and blow your circuit. This is very common on the NA and NB Miatas, because if you upgrade the fuel pump at all, people tend to just pop the circuitry. So what we go back and do is we turn the stock system, we turn the stock wire into a relay activation, and we put a standalone relay fused system in there that can supply adequate power to the aftermarket pump, which in the case of me using my surge system, that's what we do. We run a totally new system to power that surge system as a dedicated circuit. So it is important to look on there and see if you are outside of the realm of your circuitry. Some people will care if their fuel pumps are brushed or brushless. The brushless ones are a big jump in price, and they also have to have a separate pulse width modulation controller. But they're really nice pumps. They're really nice pumps. There are also other types of configurations of pumps, like there's turbine style, roller vanes, twin screw, and spur gears. Those, you really can't choose too many of those, but I will tell you that these spur gear ones, they're noisy, but they're usually very strong. And then the most important one to me is warranty. So you look at some of the companies, they'll offer 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, and some lifetime. It's a very nice detail to have if you have a lifetime warranty. That's how to choose a fuel pump. So next we move on to choosing injectors. So the choosing of the injectors, back to our calculation, you still need to know required flow, your max pressure that they are operating at, so hopefully you're within that. The spray pattern type, so that's something that you can look up, and you can see that there are people who run different types of injectors. So when you look up your injectors, you may see that they only come in a diffused pattern. They only come in a conical or a dual pattern. But that means that when you see them flowing, like the cone, it sprays in a cone. When you see the dual, it sprays sort of a left and a right stream. And then the diffused one, it's more atomized. We like atomization, but some engines may call for a different configuration of injector. Always data sheet. So you can look at the data sheet and you can see they'll give you what pressures to operate these at, and see what kind of numbers you can get from them, as well as the data sheet is important to the tuner, so the tuner knows what sort of data to put in when they enter the stuff into the ECU. You also want to make sure that the spray pattern stays consistent throughout its operation. So by that I mean there are some of them that have a window of operation, and outside of that window they start acting funny. And then once again, warranty. Warranty is a big deal. All right, regulators are a little bit easier, I feel, because when you grab your regulator, got one here, new in the box from Works, we pull this out, and once again we have a data sheet. The data sheet on here tells you that this thing is rated for approximately 1,000 horsepower. Well, where do you get 1,000 horsepower from? Because, you know, that could mean a certain amount of gas, or it could mean a different amount of methanol. Right here it says flow rating, 500 liters per hour. So the flow rating of 500 liters per hour, a good assumption means that key on, you can send 500 liters per hour through it. Because what is the biggest demand you can make of your regulator? Key on, engine not running. Because then it has to waste off 100% of fuel flow. This is why you would want to have something like a staged pump system. Because if you're running two 340 liter per hour pumps, and this thing is capable of wasting off 500, you're going to have a problem, because you're just going to be sending all this fuel that the regulator can't get rid of in a reasonable fashion. And then the pressure rating on this thing goes up to, it says minimum 30, maximum 120. So if you're planning on running over 120 psi, that's going to be a bad choice of regulator. I don't know how you're going to get to that many psi, but you know, don't use this regulator for it. This thing does have the ability to install a gauge port. It has a little 1/8 NPT on it, so you can unscrew that and stick one on, like we did for this one. These are the same regulator. And then the regulation is adjusted by this little guy on top. So what you do is you turn your key on, and then you stare at the gauge, and then you just adjust it to see where it sits. And then that's it. You set your pressure. Now, that is a detail about these that some may not have. I have seen a couple of our customers have come through and had us use these specific fuel filters that have an integrated pressure regulation on them. Those are from like the late 90s, early 2000s GM products, where it has 3 barbs on a fuel filter. 1 in, 1 return, and 1 out. So it runs as a return regulation, but it is not adjustable, and it's purely static. If that's something you need, an all-in-one solution that takes care of your business, go for it. That's the one. But the rest of us, we like to have, you know, a regulation that allows us to go against our boost, and we can, you know, reference our boost and make sure our fuel pressure stays up. There are different types of regulators as well in the regulation style. So you have deadhead regulators, bypass regulators, return or returnless, but we just mainly use return ones because in the configurations of Miatas, you send the fuel, it goes through the rail, it comes back, hits the regulator, and then you send the rest back to the tank. That's what we use. And we also like to use the external ones because you can get some that mount on the fuel rail, you can get some that are outside the fuel rail. I'm not fond of the ones that are on the fuel rail because I like to have a little more of, let's say, developed flow leaving the rail if possible. So this is one of the rails we use. This is the one from the NC Miata. This has 4 ports on it. So you can have any configuration of ins and outs from this. Heck, I could have 2 of these as ins and 2 of these as outs if I wanted. But what I like to do is I can mount my pressure gauge on here. I have the fuel coming in one side, and I have the fuel coming out of here. I would love to have it come out of the other side if there was physical room here, but usually there is something blocking the way here. But in some instances, it's really nice to have the flow go in here and out of here. And the bigger the line you can run, because these are 8ORB ports on here, if you could run a full 8ORB in and an 8ORB out, this thing would have fantastic developed flow through it, and you'd have really even flow characteristics. But you know, the rail is bigger than stock as it is, so there is more fuel sitting in here at any given time as well. But yeah, you can also get a regulator that sits on the side of this, and I'm personally just not fond of those. But it's an option if you like to have things compact. And then the last thing, of course, warranty. Right? That's always going to be a thing. Fuel filter selection is a little bit easier. You just make sure that it has the max pressure rating and the max flow rating that you need. But you really can't go too big on those. It's just sort of, you're getting a giant can, and then it's just, why'd you get such a giant filter? Then the filtration size is a deal on these. So if you go to like the Fuel Lab ones that I'm familiar with, the Fuel Lab inline filters, they are rated, you can either get a 10 micron or a 40 micron filter. So you want to have a really, really fine filtration, you get the 10 micron. You can have them be inline, like the one I was mentioning from GM, that is just an inline unit, and when you need to replace the filter, well, you throw it away and you replace it. Then you have the cartridge style, which are the ones you have them, they are unscrewable, you can pull the thing out, you can either clean the filter, replace the filter, and reassemble it and continue using it. Some of them will come with an internal check valve as well, usually the serviceable ones will, and actually I think those OEM ones do as well. Don't quote me on that one. The filters may have different materials, and that will go back to the fuel compatibility as well. So if it's made out of a certain type of material, it may disintegrate with a more aggressive fuel, maybe methanol or something. And then there is the warranty. Of course, warranty. All right, I've gone over a whole lot of topics here. I've kind of fast forwarded through it. I'm just trying to get it all done into one video, so this topic can be, you know, out there and done with. But this part of the video, I'm going to go over stuff for the NC Miata owners and enthusiasts. So a lot of you would ask me questions about NC Miata stuff. That's what I work on, quite a few of them. So let's go over the in-tank fuel unit. So I have come out with a modified version of this. It is a kit that turns this into a return fuel system. We'll discuss the pluses and minuses of it. First, let's discuss how this thing works. When this thing goes in, it's mildly compressed. Compresses, I don't know, I think it was about an inch or so. And the inlet on this, it starts filling from down here. There's a little 1/4 inch inner diameter hole, and it starts filling fuel from there. Once it gets up to this level, about an inch up from the bottom, fuel starts filling into here, but it does not get into the bucket because that's actually a separate section right here. So that separate section doesn't fill until you get a 1/2 inch from the top, which seems kind of silly to me. And then once it reaches this level, then it actually just fills over the top, which is pretty obvious. So how does this work? This is the actual fuel pump assembly. So the fuel pump sits inside of here. Inside of here, you'll see at the very top, there is a space at which the fuel pump injects fuel. And then it fills the annulus of this assembly. So this annulus gets full of fuel. That's why when you pull these out, you may be out of fuel, but this thing will still be full of it because it's on the other side of the pump. The pump fills up this space, and then there's like a filter sock at the bottom of it. It's not a true filter. It is just a pickup sock, as most people refer to it. It's not really serviceable in most aspects. And then over here on this side is the regulation assembly. So the fuel fills up the annulus, and then there's a little hole right here on that side. That's where the fuel comes through. That little tiny hole is where all the fuel is sent. Now the regulator takes up this space, and when the fuel comes in here, when the regulator is allowing passage of fuel, it goes through that top hole. That top hole leads to this little barb, and then it goes up and out of the lid through this little, I believe this was a 3/8 connection. So it comes out of that little guy. It's a pretty tiny hole in there though. It comes out of there, and then that actually sends to the front. Fully regulated beforehand because the regulator's in here. Again, this is a deadhead system. Now how does this little guy work? When the system has 55 psi coming out of it, the regulator starts to open. Then there's a little shower here. I call it a shower because when we did bench testing of this, it literally just kind of pours out like that. It's not really a spray or anything. It's returning it back into the assembly. On the other side here, we have a tube. What the heck is this tube all about? So from what I see, it seems to do like not really a 50-50, but maybe pressure-wise, a 50-50 distribution of fuel coming out of here and fuel coming out of there. So what's this guy do? Well, as we assemble this, you'll see. So this is our assembly. Let's say we have a pump already in here and a regulator. So we drop this guy in here, and this little guy sits over the top and out the side, and it clips in there. This is called a venturi. The concept here is it has a tiny, tiny hole on it. That tiny little hole is a jet. So that jet is pointed towards it's pointed into the hole, into the inlet. So as pressure is achieved in the fuel system, the excess effort from the pump is used to jet fuel that direction into the bowl. So if this thing is completely full, the venturi, the more it works, the more it keeps fuel in the bowl assembly. So when we do our regulator delete for a return system, that regulator's not there, which means the venturi is no longer working. So you can keep this guy here, but what happens is when the fuel level goes down, the fuel just doesn't stay in the basket anymore. It's not maintained, it's not kept in there. And that little shower is not working either. So you end up having this problem of, do I want to have a venturi to keep this thing full under high G loads, or do I want to have a return system? It's sort of a balance. And that's where I came out with, let's have surge systems. So it's entirely up to you what you want to do to one of these guys. But you know, if you're racing and encountering large G forces, it is not advisable to have one of the regular return systems. It's advisable to jump up to a surge system. So then you get all of the advantages. Now, another idea that I had brainstormed with one of the other guys was, well, what if you had multiple entries into the fuel rail for the deadhead system? This is actually a decent idea because then you could use one of those radium rails to have the fuel line Y off at the engine bay and enter at both sides of the fuel rail. This would cause you to have better evenness of pressure from the front to the rear of the rail, as opposed to the factory configuration that biases the first two cylinders. I don't know, food for thought. Tell me what you guys think. I hope this video has helped all of you with a better understanding of fuel systems. I hope I didn't miss too many things, but like I said, really tried to get through a whole lot of topics to be helpful in people's selections and understandings of fuel systems. But if you have anything else, feel free to drop me a line. Thanks.